Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to join us in this very important discussion, and with this very illustrious panel of experts that we have. And I think that as a community, it is so important at times like this that we stand together in unity and also approach this challenge rationally, with a framework of understanding, and with being resolute and clear, focused on what we want to do as a community. And of course, our primary concern is to look after our community, because we all know that Shuls, and that's the reason that we gathered this afternoon, is to discuss Shuls, but it actually touches on a broader issue. Of course, we know that Shuls stand at the heart and center of the South African Jewish community. Our Shuls represent and are centers of our Yiddishkeit, of who we are, of our values, of our sense of community, and our sense of connectedness to our incredible legacy and heritage as Jews. And also from a social perspective, how it connects us with our fellow community members, and how we draw a sense of strength and inspiration from that. And it's been so difficult for us not to have our Shuls functioning. And I remember that very first week when we took the decision to recommend the closure of our Shuls as the virus began. And it was one of the most painful moments for me in many, many years, because life without our Shuls seemed unthinkable. And yet here we are months later, and our Shuls are still not open. But I really feel that as a community, we need to think about the fact that it's not that we are closing our Shuls and keeping our Shuls closed, it's that we are saving lives. And Pikuach Nefesh, we know, is one of the greatest of all of our Torah values. To save a life, and even to save one life, is to save an entire world. Our sages teach us. And so it is in that holy mission that we have been holding our Shuls closed, so that we can save lives, protect our community, protect our country. And at the same time, however, we need to understand a framework. When will we be able to get back to our Shuls? How does that look? And so that's what this afternoon is about. We've communicated some of these ideas in writing, but here's an opportunity to hear from the leading experts in our community, medical experts, to guide us on this path so that we can understand the framework. And really, when we're discussing Shuls, what we're really discussing is the framework of how our community is dealing with COVID-19, and what that means, and what the state of threat is at the moment. And we need to understand that carefully as a community, so that we can protect ourselves, protect our community, protect our families, protect our fellow countrymen, protect our country as we go through these very challenging times. And so at a time like this, we need to have a sense of perspective and rationality and a sense of analysis. And that's why we've called this meeting, to understand what is the situation at the moment, how do our Shuls fit in, and what would be the moment, the criterion that we could use to return to our Shuls. And so we have a very illustrious panel of experts, and this is the amazing blessing that we have in our community, this incredible blessing that we have such top medical experts, such top scientists in our community, who are able to help us in the most profound way through total dedication and volunteerism, and a sense of real dedication and loyalty to community. And so we're indeed privileged. So the first person I'd like to ask to share his thoughts with us on the situation, to give us the overview, is Professor Barry Schoub, who's an expert who needs no introduction. The community knows as the founding director of one of the key scientific and medical centers, which investigates the NICD, which investigates and understands communicable diseases, and is a founding professor, a founder of that, and a professor in this field. And so we're indeed privileged to have Professor Schoub with us. He has been guiding our community since the beginning of our challenges of encountering COVID-19. And Professor Schoub will now share an overview and particularly looking at the issue of Shuls, but also in the broader context of our community. So Professor Schoub, I hand over to you. Thank you so much for your time and for your guidance and dedication throughout all of these months.
Thank you very much, Chief Rabbi. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is very briefly sketch why we are in such a dangerous position at the moment, and then also particularly focus on why Shuls themselves are a particularly dangerous environment for the spread of the virus. So first of all, where are we now? Well, globally, as probably many of you know, we really hit a milestone. We're just over 10 million cases worldwide. To be precise, 10,005,970 cases are known throughout the world, and close on 500,000 deaths, close on 500,000 deaths, 499,506 deaths. Now, most of these figures, of course, come from the Northern Hemisphere, countries which have had mature epidemics, and are now, in fact, mostly over their phase of the epidemic. So the most rapid growing epidemic in the world now has shifted from the Northern Hemisphere countries to the so-called developing world in the Southern Hemisphere. And one of the fastest growing countries in the world, in fact, is South Africa. We have the unenviable distinction at the moment of hovering between the 5th and 6th fastest growing epidemic in the world. So why is South Africa in such a very bad position? I think there are three main reasons. Clearly, as my colleague, Dr. Richard Friedland, will show you just now in the models, we are on the upward trajectory of the epidemic curve, the rapidly expanding exponential curve of the epidemic. That's the first thing. And we haven't reached the peak yet. The worst is still to come. And this is aggravated by the economic necessity to lift most of those restrictions, which we had previously in lockdown 5 and lockdown 4, and even some of them in lockdown 3. And there's a dangerous misperception that the epidemic is now coming under control because these restrictions have been lifted. And unfortunately, of course, as the restrictions are lifted, as most people are back at work, as many of the schools are opening, as restaurants are opening, etc., and you can see it in the streets outside, that people have this misunderstanding, this misperception that things are back to normal, and nothing could be further from the truth at the moment. And this is even further aggravated, possibly by going into the winter season, with the influenza season coming upon us, which will also aggravate the coronavirus epidemic. There is, in fact, also evidence that, in fact, the low humidity, the dryness of the air, the low temperature may itself also promote virus transmission. So we have all these things coming together, which really put us into a particularly vulnerable position at the moment. And this is why, and I'll emphasize it again at the end of this brief talk, why particularly now when we don't have these physical restrictions, that we do depend on behavioral demands, on how we distance ourselves, how we wear masks, wash our hands, etc. Now, why Shuls in particular, as the Chief Rabbi mentioned, why are they particularly problematic with regard to the virus transmission? Well, what we do know, and remember we're now, about 7 months into the pandemic, so we're still learning, but what we do know quite clearly from observations around the world is that the transmission of the virus to a large extent occurs in clusters or so-called hotspots. And there are things that we call super spreading events. In other words, events where the transmission of the virus occurs particularly rapidly. And a prime example of this, in fact, is where people congregate together, for example, functions, parties, etc., and also houses of worship. And this is why when the houses of worship restriction was lifted, it came in for a lot of criticism from many quarters, not least of which from the prime public health body of the country, the College of Public Health Medicine, which registers public health practitioners, specialists. So why, let me just go on to well, if you talk about houses of worship, of course, there have been many outbreaks in houses of worship which have been documented throughout the world. Outbreaks where you have a single or maybe a few infected people coming into a situation of a house of worship and very, very rapid spread. Many of them have reached the lay press, and many of them have reached the medical press as well. Why the Jewish population? And of course, they have, if we look at, for example, the United Kingdom, I think it's well known that the Jewish population has been affected out of proportion to their proportion in the population. Look at the United Kingdom, where Jews comprise 0.3% of the population, but had 1.7% of the mortality, nearly 5 times out of proportion to the population. We look at France, for example, where Jews are 0.8% of the population, but comprise 5.0% of the deaths, over 6 times their proportion in the population. There's actually some interesting statistics which come from the Office of National Statistics of the United Kingdom, where they looked at mortality in relation to religious affiliation. And it's interesting when they looked at the age standardized mortality rate in the United Kingdom. The top of the list was in fact the Muslim population with 198.9, but very close behind was the Jewish population with 187.9.
Lawrence?
And this is more than 2 times the...
Can you see me? I'm in. Can you see me?
More than 2 times the proportion compared to Christians, and actually more than 2.5 times those professing no religion at all. But when you looked at males over the age of 65, in other words, a particular risk group, Jews more than Muslims, Jews were the top of the list, and in fact more than 3 times those professing no religion at all. So why in fact have Jews been particularly singled out with the coronavirus epidemic? These are figures, of course, from the Northern Hemisphere. There may be some, we can speculate on some of these reasons. Could possibly be due to seeding events. We know that the epidemics in many of the countries overseas, United Kingdom, France, particularly the United States, it was preceded by various events, Purim parties, for example, and so on, in both the United States and the United Kingdom. They might have seeded the virus into the population, then amplified itself in the population. It may be due to the fact that Jews are a more urbanized population, and we know that that the epidemic is more pronounced in urban as compared to rural populations. It may be due to the fact that Jews are maybe a slightly wealthier bracket of the population, and therefore more likely to have traveled in the early phases of the epidemic and again introduced the virus. And we're talking again, let me stress, of the Northern Hemisphere. Maybe an age factor, that Jews are a slightly older age group. And also it may be, in fact, the congregate practices of Jews. And I think this is really where we come to the Shuls situation. And we can speculate why the practices of Shuls lend themselves to promote virus transmission. Is it because we are 3 minyanim per day, 7 days a week? Is it because Shuls are a hyper-socialization environment? Is it because there's a large amount of singing, which you know generates more infectious droplets? There's no evidence, no proof of this. These are just speculations. We can take a cue, of course, from non-Jewish houses of worship, where themselves are congregate environments which facilitate the spread of the virus. But the evidence really comes from some statistics, mainly from Israel, in fact. The Coronavirus National Information and Knowledge Center, which is the government body in Israel which provides advisory services to the health ministry in Israel, they came out with their statistics quite recently, where they traced the point of infection comprised 24% point of infection of the epidemic, 24%, the top of the list. Hotels, just by comparison, were 15%, restaurants 12%, supermarkets 7%, other stores 7%, yeshivot 5%. And interestingly enough, schools didn't come on the radar at all. Also, there is some evidence from the Haredi community, again, which apparently comprise 70% of all statistics in Israel. So Shuls do seem to be from that evidence, Shuls do seem to be from the speculative evidence, or a particular hub of transmission. And this is why particularly now, and this is the worst stage of the epidemic, one has to be doubly careful. And I need to, as a final word, again reiterate what I said early on, that we are relying now on behavioral demands. The physical restrictions have been lifted. We rely on behavioral demands, how people physically distance themselves, how they avoid social gatherings, how they wear masks, how they wash their hands, particularly now in this stage of the epidemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So appreciate your sharing this afternoon. And just to give the context of the structure of today, we're going to hear, we've just heard from Professor Schoub. We're going to hear a presentation now from Dr. Richard Friedland, and then a very short word from Professor Ephraim Kramer, and then we're going to be able to open up for questions. And so what people can start to do is submit your questions on the Q&A platform, and then we'll take as many of the questions as we can. We want to aim to finish at around 5 o'clock today, because we know that people's time is very precious. So that's going to be the overall structure. I think what is very important in terms of what Professor Schoub mentioned is obviously the context of risk when it comes to Shuls in particular, but I think it also needs to be understood as well in the broader context of our community, because as the infection rate increases, and Dr. Friedland will talk directly to that, it means that as a community, this is the time of maximum danger, and we need to therefore take precautions across the board. I think Shuls should be an indicator to the community that we are still in a very dangerous time period of the development of this virus and its spread, because if it were any less serious, we would certainly want to open our Shuls, which are such an important part of our lives, for people to say Kaddish and Yortzites and Bar Mitzvah boys and daily minyanim and layaning and all of these things which are so important to us from a spiritual, from an emotional, from a social, from a mitzvah point of view. And so, of course, that should be the indicator to our community of how serious the situation is, and to put it into that context in terms of how we conduct ourselves in the rest of what we do during the week. And it should be the indicator. I'd like to ask now Dr. Richard Friedland to address us. Dr. Friedland, as you all know, is the CEO of the Netcare hospitals, and he has also guided and helped our community together with Professor Schoub right from the beginning of this crisis. And he brings a very important perspective on this understanding, not only from a scientific point of view, but from a practical point of view, looking at it on the ground, and what is happening in South Africa at the moment from the perspective of a group of hospitals and doctors who are on the front lines of this. And so we're very privileged to be able to hear from Dr. Friedland, and I think it's an enormous privilege as a community that we have scientists and doctors of the caliber of Professor Schoub and Dr. Friedland to give us this kind of perspective. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Friedland to share his thoughts and presentation with us.
Thank you very, very much, Chief Rabbi, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be able to talk to you this afternoon and do this presentation to you. I want to make a few opening comments before sharing this presentation, if you'll allow me. As most of us are enjoying the comfort of our own homes or our offices this afternoon as we debate this important task, I would ask that we pause for a moment. Pause to acknowledge the enormous sacrifice and commitment of those on the front line. Those healthcare workers, be they cleaners, be they porters, security, catering staff, and of course our medical personnel, allied healthcare professionals, paramedics, nurses, and doctors. Let's pause to acknowledge their enormous commitment and sacrifice at a time of great need and of anxiety in our own country. They're all out there facing this unprecedented storm and putting themselves in danger so that we can all remain safe. The second point I want to make is that, yes, these are difficult, extraordinary, unprecedented, and whatever other adjective we choose to use, times in our country and indeed globally. But I do believe there is cause for hope. Whilst we are in God's hands, we have to bring every possible effort to ensure that we adhere strictly to all of the precautionary measures during this very dangerous time. And it has been shown globally how we choose to respond in these moments of danger, particularly during the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic, will really, to a large extent, determine our outcome. The third point I want to make is that the textbook on COVID-19 is yet to be written. The pandemic is but 6 months old. Over 4,000 scientific articles have been written on this pandemic, and in many cases, we're none the wiser. And I want to caveat this afternoon's presentation by saying that none of us are experts. We'll be presenting a view formulated by Professor Schoub and myself, and based on a model that we've developed within our own organization to guide our organization. There'll be plenty of different views out there, all of which we respect. Again, over the last 6 months, you would have been exposed to thousands of facts and figures and statistics. The British Prime Minister during the reign of Queen Victoria, Benjamin Disraeli, said there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. We're going to show you some statistics that we believe are important in understanding this pandemic. We've built a model within our organization that allows us to track this infection, to understand the evolution of this infection, and get a better understanding of how it is impacting all of us. I'm going to begin the presentation now. I hope you can all see that. Why is it that we rely on modeling of human behavior to try and understand what it is we're trying to achieve? And I think that making decisions in the face of uncertainty is challenging, especially during a pandemic. Quantitative models, therefore, help us understand and navigate this ambiguous environment. But many of the models we've seen out there, including our own, are based on key assumptions and can produce large variations in outcomes. And probably the most important element of them is the quality of the data. As we often say, garbage in is garbage out. What we've shown also is that assumptions are not static and they're subject to significant change. Last week, I presented to various members of the community and a technical committee our model, warning that what we were seeing in the Gauteng may well lead to a significant change. And indeed, over the past 7 days, that has happened, which demonstrates the significant change that these models can undergo. We have fitted statistical models to the daily increase in infection rates. We believe this is the most accurate way of predicting the evolution of this pandemic. And lastly, as I've made the point earlier, and the Chief Rabbi has also commented on this, as has Professor Schoub, the spread of this virus is so dependent on human behavior and the adherence to preventative measures. And in our country, particularly population density. I'm going to show you later the population density in our country, and I think you'll begin to understand why it is that South Africa is particularly at risk, and particularly the Gauteng. And then here you'll see a wonderful quote on the left-hand side from a British statistician George E.P. Box, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I hope you'll find the model we're presenting to you and that will update on a weekly basis for the community useful. So how have we modeled this infection? Firstly, on the right-hand side, you can see that we've broken it into 4 component parts. We looked at the actual cases to about April 14th. We then began populating this model with the actual data and predicting the progression to what we call a peak, akin to climbing a mountain. And then we modeled how long that peak or plateau would last, and then began predicting how long and when that recovery would take and what would occur post-recovery. You can see from this graph that our risk of transmitting the disease and contracting the disease increases exponentially as the cases increase, as we're seeing at the moment, until we reach the peak and until we see a decrease in the number of actual cases. And you can see here, I've highlighted here on the left-hand side, what are the factors that we'll be looking at? One, recovery, absolute reduction in daily new cases. Are the number of cases reducing on a daily basis? Importantly, is the reduction in the ratio of positive tests to total tests reducing? Let me give you an example. In early March, in March and May of this year, only 2.7% of all people tested positive, of those tested. That rose in April to 5%. In early June, it was 7%. In mid-June, 8%. Last week, it was 13.2%. And last night, it was 20%. We saw in Italy that at the peak of their infections and pandemics, the percentage of positive tests to total tests went as high as 24%. A key indicator is also the number of recovered cases versus active cases. I'm going to show you this in the next slide of what this really means. And then also we look at a reduction in hospitalizations. This lags by about 10 to 14 days. And then we also look at a reduction in deaths. And this also lags between 10 and 17 days. Let's have a look at the numbers quickly, just to understand where we are. And then I'm going to show you the model for South Africa and break it down per province. And you'll see the different dynamics occurring in each of the provinces. So looking at these numbers, you can see right here at the bottom, and these are the latest stats. You can see right here, excuse me, going back one, you can see at the bottom we've had a total of 131,000 cases, almost a 50% increase since where we were last week in terms of the number of new cases in South Africa. Last night was reported 7,210 new cases. And these are the recoveries and the number of active cases. But to better understand this pandemic, let's have a look at each of the provinces. What you can see here in the Gauteng is the total number of active cases. In other words, cases that have occurred in the last 14 days represents 82% of the total number of cases in the Gauteng. And recoveries only represent some 18%. It tells you we're at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of this very steep curve in the Gauteng. It's just beginning to take off. We define recoveries as people who have not died after 14 days, who have not been readmitted to hospital and are clinically better. If you look at the Western Cape, however, you can see that the vast majority of cases are in recovery, and only 26% of cases are active cases. And that tells you we are peaking in the Western Cape. What is interesting is still the number of new cases here on the left, 1,374 versus recoveries of 1,193 tells you we haven't peaked yet. And in fact, we're still seeing more new cases and more active cases than recoveries, but the ratio is very, very favorable. These are important issues to bear in mind when we look at the recovery, particularly going forward in South Africa. All of this data is available to you, and I urge you to look at it. It's available on a wonderful website down here at the bottom, www.covid19sa.org. It's a very accurate website, one that we use extensively, run by the National Research Foundation, Wits University, and other organizations. And you can get the daily stats from this website. Now, have a look at how the number of active cases have increased since the 5th of March, and in particular, since the 10th of June. And this demonstrates it across all of the different provinces. And what I really want to demonstrate to you here, this is when our first case occurred on the 5th of March. This is when the lockdown began. I know there's been a lot of criticism of the lockdown. If you want to see a quintessential example of a country that has ignored lockdown, look no further than Brazil, which is absolutely catastrophic in the number of infections and the uncontrollable number of hospitalizations and deaths. If you look to its neighbor, Argentina, you will understand how effective the lockdown has been. And so I think our government and Department of Health has done an extraordinary job during imposing this lockdown and delaying, at least delaying, and hopefully helping to flatten this curve. You can see here in April as level 4 begins, and again as level 3 begins and schools reopen. And I put this all over here because when you look at the data that you see here today, what is important to realize is that it represents, and Professor Abdul Karim, head of the Minister of Health's Medical Advisory Committee, has often told us this, that what you're seeing here today really represents what happened 14 days ago. And certainly in public schools, there has been significant outbreaks of this infection, and we have also seen this infection outbreak in businesses. And here you can see the steady rise across the different provinces. What does it look like in terms of population density? And I think this really shows the incredible challenges that we face in South Africa, in particular in the Gauteng. The Gauteng has 835 people per square meter. It is by far the most populous area and province in our country. Just to give you an example, Alexander has a population density of 110,000 people per square kilometer. It's the highest in the world. Even the favelas, or the so-called slums of Sao Paulo in Brazil, are at 70,000. And we've actually determined per area in South Africa what these population densities are, because we believe that they're a critical factor in spreading the virus. Here on the right-hand side, you can see what we're now seeing in the Gauteng, and which is of grave concern to all of us. This absolute explosion in cases, some 685% in the last 3 weeks. This graph demonstrates the weeks of the year, starting with the first case on the 5th of March to where we find ourselves today. So what does this all mean when we now look, well, before we get there, let's just have a look again from this website at the breakdown in the various districts in Johannesburg. And you can go into the metro districts of other areas on this website as well, and you can track the daily increase in cases in these various areas. And I can tell you that there's been a significant doubling in most of these areas. I show this to you just to demonstrate the level of granularity available to each and every one of you in understanding what's happening in your specific region or metropole. Now let's get on to the model and what we've modeled in terms of where we are at the moment. South African cases are really tracking a model that we presented last week, and we are within 5% of that at the moment. However, the last 3 days have been extremely concerning in terms of the number of cases. And the next 7 days are going to be absolutely critical in determining the trajectory of this pandemic in South Africa. Let me explain this model in more detail. We had initially modeled a best case scenario, seen here in green, versus a worst case scenario, seen here in red. And what you can see in the green scenario was a pandemic for the country. Again, it varies by geography, and I'll show you that next. You can see a pandemic in South Africa that would on average peak in early July, and that we would start recovering in late July, early August, and have a residual number of cases going forward. The worst case scenario predicted that we wouldn't peak in July, but closer to August and early September, and only start recovering in October. Given the number of actual cases, you can see it by the squiggly yellow line, we're now predicting and modeling a blended view of what this pandemic might look like. And unfortunately, when you look at this, not only is it a combination or somewhere in between best case and worst case, it demonstrates that we will be in this plateau phase for several weeks. Let's have a look at it on a provincial basis. Again, I want to caveat this specific slide by saying the next 7 days will really be critical in determining the true trajectory of this curve. Each province has its own trajectory, and you can see it, we've modeled it per province. This is where we are now, and on the left-hand side of this demonstrates the actual data of new cases per day in each province. You can see that the Western Cape is beginning to plateau here in yellow, and they should recover through June and July and be able to return to normal activity as we recover, as the risk diminishes. Sorry, let's go back one. You can see also the Eastern Cape, although we're going through a horrific period at the moment, we are peaking there. And again, that shows a good recovery, not dissimilar to the Western Cape. KwaZulu-Natal is interesting in the sense that they will peak later than the rest of the country. Some of this may be due to the warmer weather. We're not absolutely certain. It'll be a lower peak, and we're very concerned about the eThekwini or Durban district and Durban North. But that's what that curve looks like. And I'm afraid the peak in the Gauteng is very, very significant, as you can now see it running right through July into August and really coming off that peak in the middle, early to middle part of September. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to illustrate to you here is that this is where the model is at the moment. We believe very clearly that until we are in the recovery phase of each of these provincial areas, and that we can see the number of active cases reducing, and the number of recoveries increasing, the number of hospitalizations decreasing, the number of deaths decreasing, and the number of tests that are positive as a percentage of the total tests reducing, it would be premature to think of opening up any of our Shuls. I know I've shown you an enormous amount of data. We're happy to explain this in more detail and share these models on a regular basis as they change. And so finally, in conclusion, let me say that until the recovery phase has begun, we should be adopting an abundance of caution to the opening of Shuls. And even when this is achieved, may I please ask that we maintain absolutely strict precautions, and they should be maintained certainly for the coming months. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Friedland. So appreciate your presentation and the questions which are coming through, which we'll get to the questions shortly in a moment. But thank you so much for such an important presentation, which really gives perspective. And if I can just add to that, in essence, what emerges, and this is the thing that we've been looking for, is an objective criterion for our Shuls. And to say that at the moment we are in the stage of the graph climbing, in the sense that there's increasing infections, and the rate of the increase is climbing each and every single day. And so this is the time actually of maximum danger of the threat of this virus. And so therefore at this point, the medical opinion is very clear that this is not the right time for our Shuls to open because of these dangers. But that once that graph turns and the rate of infections and the increase of the infections begins to decrease, and a number of the other factors which Dr. Friedland mentioned, then we'll have an objective point where we will know as a community, and the numbers will tell us that story. It's not going to be a matter of discretion. It's the numbers will tell us that story. And I think what is also so compelling for us as a community is that this model and this criterion is exactly what Dr. Friedland is actually using in the context of the Netcare hospitals as well. So we are following what they are doing, and therefore we have a very important framework within which to be able to return to Shuls. At the moment, as we can see, that we're in the moment of maximum danger, so there isn't an imminent return to Shuls until that graph turns and that we begin to get onto the other side of the spike of it. But at a certain point, in the not too distant future, we will then be able to return to our Shuls. But even when we do so, at that point, we're going to need to do it under strict protocols of health and safety. So it's in that context, although it's not immediately relevant for now, it's in that context that I just wanted to introduce the community to Professor Ephraim Kramer, just to share a few words. Professor Kramer will only talk in brief today, because the focus of today is really to understand the overall environment in which we're operating, and to understand that we will not be, in the immediate now in the next few weeks, will not be returning to our Shuls, but there will be a time, in the near future, that we will be able to, once that graph turns, please God, with Hashem's help. But at that point, we're going to need to gear up for it, because the virus will still be around, and we're going to need to gear up for it. And so in that context, I've asked Professor Kramer not only to speak today, but to head up a division within our Shuls, in the same way that we have CSO in our Shuls to protect from a security point of view. We're going to, until there is a vaccine or a cure, we are going to need to have a system of operating of which can make our Shuls as safe as possible from a corona point of view. And Professor Kramer has very kindly volunteered to train up a team of volunteers in our Shuls to be able to do that. Professor Kramer is uniquely qualified to do this. He's a professor of emergency medicine, but he's also a specialist in mass gatherings, and in fact is one of the senior medical people in FIFA, and was the head medical officer of the FIFA World Cup in Russia. And so he had 6,000 people reporting to him at that World Cup. So his specialty is in mass gatherings. I always joke with Professor Kramer, whether it's easier to run the World Cup in Russia with 6,000 people reporting to him, or managing our Shuls. But that, of course, is said in jest. But Professor Kramer is just going to share very briefly, because we're not going to get into too much of that detail today, because that's going to be for a future webinar. We'll be able to go into more detail into it. But I just wanted Professor Kramer to introduce himself to the community, and for the community to know that the process of preparing our Shuls for the day that we can reopen is beginning, and we have to start working on it. So as soon as the medical data allows us to return, we'll be ready on that first day to be able to make that return. So Professor Kramer is just going to share a few words with us. I hand you over to Professor Kramer.
Chief Rabbi, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm kind of the Chief Rabbi's return to shul nuts and bolts man. And there to be able to make sure that everything actually works and everything is ready. As the Chief Rabbi said, with the day that it comes that my esteemed colleagues say we can go back to school, go back to shul, we have to be ready. We have to be ready, in fact, within the hour. We can't now start planning. So with the Chief Rabbi's mandate to daven without danger, we are already in the process of getting everything ready. It really is quite simple. We take the medical plan that I had for the FIFA World Cup in Russia, where you've got 11 cities and 12 stadiums, and you've got 3 million people to look after. And you just take it down to 4 cities, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Durban, Pretoria. You put it into about 60 shuls. You've got tens of thousands of Jews, and away we go. We do the same thing with the same protocol, with the same discipline. So I suppose at the end of the day, instead of having President Putin, I've now got the Chief Rabbi Goldstein. And we just do the same thing that we did. The quantity might change, but the quality is the same. It has to do with safety, it has to do with discipline, it has to do with compliance. And at the moment, we have a protocol. I have people working with me from the CSO, from Mutsola, people from the Shuls. And the protocol is a living document. Everybody reads it. People got ideas, they send it in. If it's worthy, we put it in. And we make sure that every single shul will be ready to do what they need to do. I've already started inspecting shuls, speaking with Rabbonim, and getting every single shul to have its own adaptation of the protocol that's there. So currently, my colleagues are the ones that need the greater voice. They really need to educate and update everybody, so we all are in a situation where we are protecting ourselves as much as we can. When the time comes, when we open up the shuls, you'll hear from me, and no doubt you'll really hear from me. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kramer. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your commitment on this project. Professor Kramer will be doing on-site inspections to do risk assessment at all of the shuls. He's even offered to drive down to Cape Town and Durban to do on-site inspections to be able to, to do a risk assessment. So we're taking it very seriously, and I think it's important for the community to know that those preparations are being made, but at the same time we have the context. And I think what is so important from all of this is to realize the context in which we're operating as a community, which affects not only our shuls, but everything that we do. It's not that our shuls are the sole focus here. They are part of what we are focusing, but to realize that obviously this is something which is broader. And so we're going to take some of the questions that came on the Q&A line. I'm going to wanted to aim today to finish as close to 5 o'clock as possible. Maybe we'll run over a few minutes, but we'll try and take as many questions as we can. I'm going to just read the questions as they appear and deal with as many as we can. I'll put it to our panel. I think these are mainly questions for Professor Schoub and Dr. Friedland, and we will. The idea is, I think that next week we can gather again at 4 o'clock for an update, to have a look at the numbers and to take further questions. So I think that's also part of the plan. And I know that there were many people who tried to get in, and the webinar was full. And so we will also be making a recording of this available to the community, and we'll make plans for next week to be able to accommodate everybody, although it is streaming live on Facebook, on the Sinai and Darba Facebook page. So let's take some of the questions. I saw Prof Schoub, Dr. Friedland, there were questions that came. Someone was asking about shuls getting back on time for Rosh Hashanah, and where we're headed in terms of that. And another question that came is that how come the shuls are closed but the schools are open? Those were two of the questions. I thought let's maybe start with those two questions. We'll get to more questions, but my understanding in terms of the first is that we're going to be driven by the numbers, and the numbers will tell the story. But perhaps if we could have a look at that. Let's start with a rough idea in terms of the time frame.
So I wonder if I could come in there, Chief Rabbi, and answer that first part in the sense that one has to look at this on a provincial basis. And I certainly believe in Cape Town, the way the curve is looking and the number of recoveries are now exceeding the number of active cases, that they were the first to experience this pandemic, and they should come out of this in the month of July with a good recovery in August, and certainly by the 19th of September, when Rosh Hashanah, I believe should be in a position to get back to services. And again, we will monitor that. Our biggest caveat, and I want to make this point very clear, I didn't make it earlier, is our concern about interprovincial travel. You know, once you reintroduce interprovincial travel, which may well happen at the end of the month, if we go down to a level 2, you may see an inadvertent spread from one province to the other. And this is a grave concern for us about the Western Cape. And that's why we'll continue to model it, but that's where it looks like. And equally for Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, we think that they'll be able to recover through the month of late July and August. It's different in KwaZulu-Natal, and we'll have to watch that carefully. And certainly in the Gauteng, the next 7 days are going to determine exactly when we'll be able to start looking at a recovery. And it really depends as whether we're peaking now or whether we're going to see an increase in more cases over the next few days. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, Prof, if you want to have a look at the other question.
About the schools, yeah.
Yes.
This is a question which, of course, has come my way many times, and for that reason, I actually put an insert on the South African Jewish Board of Deputies website, where I actually gave 13 reasons why schools should close and why schools could open. I think this is largely dictated by data coming from many studies around the world, where they showed that classroom transmission, and I'm just summarizing those 13 points. Classroom transmission is a very minute, very tiny proportion of what actually constitutes the transmission of the virus. Very small. And they've done studies in many countries, in Taiwan, in Netherlands, in Sweden, in Iceland, and in Australia, where during the epidemic they actually did open schools or they did close schools, either way. And they showed that either that the opening of schools didn't increase the epidemic or closing of schools didn't close down the epidemic. There are many reasons for this. Children, as you all know, don't get the infection seriously at all. Most of them, in fact, get it asymptomatically. That's the one point. But importantly, also from an epidemic point of view, they're very poor transmitters of the virus. In fact, when you go to the younger children, they're in fact almost not transmitters at all. And there are a number of physiological reasons for that I won't go into now, but if anybody's interested, they can contact me. There are a number of physiological reasons why this is so. So as far as children is concerned, the safest place for them, in fact, is school. And it's been noticed that, in fact, when the school holidays occur in many of these countries, then, in fact, the infections in children do increase. And the great majority of those infections are not from the school. They're actually household transmission or else non-school contacts. Now, of course, there is a little bit of a concern with regard to the adult teachers and adult staff, but that's no more than adult teachers or staff or adults going to work. And in fact, the rate of transmission in the schools to adults is considerably less than people going to work. So you take all this into account, the schools really constitute a very small percentage of transmission. And this is borne out by the data I gave earlier on. The schools didn't, in fact, even appear on the radar when the Israeli coronavirus information data showed that schools are 25% and schools not at all, and shops and hotels and so on, all in between that.
Okay, thank you. Other questions which are coming in here is, and I'll just put them all out and we can maybe address them. One is, what is the progress on vaccines, and what is the time frame on that? Also, is there a concern of a second wave in South Africa? But I suppose we're in the middle of our first. And another question here is, why is South Africa so far behind the peak compared to the rest of the world? So those are some of the questions that have come. Dr. Friedland, Professor Schoub, do you want to take those one or some of those questions?
Professor, do you want to answer the one on vaccines, and I'll take some of the others?
Yeah, okay, I'll start with the vaccines. As we all know, there's a tremendous amount of research, a tremendous amount of energy, also financed in going to develop a vaccine. Normally vaccines, I've been involved in some vaccines. You take the rotavirus vaccine, that took about 4 or 5 years to develop. Some other vaccines even longer. The rate of development for a coronavirus vaccine has been actually concertinaed down to make it very, very much more rapid. At the moment, they're saying like 160 candidate vaccines which are undergoing evaluation. Of these, about 15 are already going into human trials, and 2 of them are in fact in what we call phase 3 trials, of which this South African group under my colleague Professor Shabir Mahdi is one of the arms, in fact, evaluating that. But it has to go through a whole series of steps. It's got to go through laboratory evaluations, it's got to go through animal evaluation, it's got to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 human trials to look for safety, look for stability, look for efficacy. So there's no ways that we're going to have a vaccine this year. Although I've heard a quip that we'll probably have a vaccine about 2 weeks before the American election, but I wouldn't take that too seriously. So we won't have a vaccine. This will be sometime next year. And it's not only having a vaccine, it's got to be cheap, it's got to be affordable, it's got to be available, it's got to be universally available. And that's probably going to be sometime later in the latter part of next year for those reasons.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Friedland, on the other questions, any?
So the issue of a second wave is one that worries us enormously, because if we do lessen our guard, that's certainly what we'll see. And if you see it in the United States today, they celebrated success with this virus, and we're now seeing very large second waves appearing in Florida and Texas that are far worse than the initial wave. And I want to caution against this post-lockdown euphoria. And that's what happens. We lessen our guard, we have lockdown fatigue, and we think the virus is gone. And we have to be as vigilant in the post-lockdown phase and when the virus is diminishing than we are when it's rising. And again, people are asking this question, why are we still seeing a peak when we've been in lockdown? In reality, we're in a paradoxical situation where government has been forced to relax the lockdown for very real socioeconomic reasons: poverty, hunger, starvation, and a real concern about law and order. But in truth, if we were a wealthier country that could afford it, we should have remained in lockdown until we had reached the peak of this pandemic. And I hope that answers it. Chief, I wonder if I could just, I've seen some of the questions. There are a lot of questions around data and the veracity of the data. And if I could just quickly respond to those, if I may.
Yes, certainly. And I'll tell you what we're going to do is we're going to look to wrap this up today in the next few minutes, because we said we'd try and keep it close to 5 o'clock as possible. But what we'd like to do is to gather again next Sunday at 4 o'clock, same time. And people in the interim, all of these questions, send your questions to office@chiefrabbi.co.za, office@chiefrabbi.co.za. Mark it in the subject, questions, and we will then also have a chance to go through all of those questions and present on them next week, as well as getting the update in terms of the numbers, which I think is so important. Dr. Friedland, if I may just jump in there just on one positive note, because I know that we've been dealing with a lot of serious news here this afternoon. In terms of the developments of the treatment of the disease, maybe you could just share for a few minutes, the developments that you have made, that your doctors have made in terms of treating the disease and the advancements in that.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Rabbi. I think that one of the silver linings of coming into this pandemic later than other countries is that we've had the opportunity to learn what works and what doesn't work. And clearly our treatment protocols are becoming more effective, they're more rational, and certainly what we're seeing throughout South Africa is, as a result, hopefully people are staying for shorter periods in ICU and high care, and hopefully we'll be able to reduce the mortality rate. There isn't a cure at the moment. That will come with a vaccine, hopefully. But what we've seen of late is that there are different modalities of giving oxygen therapy. Not everyone needs to be ventilated. There's high flow nasal flow. There are other forms of oxygenation that are very helpful. And we're now seeing the use of corticosteroids, the use of colchicine. Now, colchicine is a drug, a very cheap drug used in the treatment of gout that has anti-inflammatory properties, and the use of the importance of vitamins, particularly vitamin D, vitamin C, and zinc in this process. I think what we're also seeing is the critical role for general practitioners in keeping people out of the hospital and monitoring them at home. And so I think as this disease progresses, we certainly believe that treatments will improve and become more efficacious. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think what we're going to do is, I know that there are lots of questions to still be addressed, and I know Dr. Friedland wanted to address some of the questions on the model. Dr. Friedland, is there something that you can share on that briefly before we wrap up, and then maybe Professor Schoub, if there's a closing comment, and then I will close after that.
Sure.
Thank you very, very much for this opportunity, Chief Rabbi, and thank you for your leadership in organizing this and the stewardship that you have shown over this period for the entire community. I think we're blessed to have you leading the community and with your wisdom and guidance, and these webinars and sessions are critical. And so deep felt thanks from my part and on behalf of all healthcare workers on the front line. We want people to be safe, we want them to be healthy, and we want them not to have need of hospitalization at all. I think there are a number of questions around data. And as I said in the beginning, there are lots of different forms of data. As George Box said, all models are wrong and some are useful. We're using the data points that we think are absolutely the most accurate. There's a lot of controversy around death rates. We can address it next week and how we measure it. But again, all of these are subject to looking at the trends and the models. And that's why we don't look at a single day. We look at the last 7 days to gain a trend. And slowly but surely, we are able to assess that trend. And a lot of people have asked questions about the number of tests and delays in testing. That's why we look at the percentage of the tests conducted, and we believe that smooths out over time. I can't answer all of the questions in that regard, but hopefully we can address them next week. And if I may just have one closing remark. We're at an incredibly dangerous time. We have a responsibility to look after each other, to look after our loved ones, and to call out behavior that puts every one of us in danger. During a pandemic like this, we are as strong as our weakest link. Please make sure you're the strongest link in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Friedland. Professor Schoub, any closing comment?
Yep. Thank you very much, Chief Rabbi. And again, to iterate Richard's thanks to you for organizing this and for what you've done. I also want to thank Dr. Richard Friedland, for his extremely valuable input into this exercise, providing such valuable data, and also Professor Kramer for what he's done. It's absolutely outstanding job, and I think we're really so grateful to have that input because it's going to be a very, very critical input when we do open the Shuls. That's going to be so important. And then also finally, just what I said before, that we are really totally dependent on behavior. We don't have the physical restrictions that have been largely lifted. We really depend on people's behavior, and particularly in the Jewish community, there are many people who are just blissfully unaware of how serious this epidemic is. We are really going through a tremendous plague at the moment, and people need to understand how serious it is, and they need to kind of be so vigilant, so assiduous, if I could say that, in how they implement all the preventive strategies that we've outlined. Thank you again, Chief Rabbi.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists, each one of you, Professor Schoub, Dr. Friedland, Professor Kramer. I think we are blessed as a community to have such outstanding scientists and medical experts who are members of our community and care and love our community like we do, and who are leaders in their fields. And I think that is truly a blessing. I also want to just say in closing, firstly, that next week, 4 o'clock on Sunday, we'll gather again for an update, and send in your questions to office@chiefrabbi.co.za during the course of the week. And then we'll also get an update on the numbers. Dr. Friedland will present on the numbers next week, and we'll be able to take more questions. I know that we only managed to get to a few of them. At a future point, we'll also have a more in-depth discussion with Professor Kramer as we get closer to the moment of reopening. What I wanted to say as a concluding remark is this: we are looking at all of this from a medical and scientific point of view, and that is right. And we have this great mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives, and that we are not so much keeping our shuls closed as we are saving lives, and that's how we need to view it. But also to respond spiritually, to realize that ultimately everything and all of us are in the hands of Hashem, and that God works through the doctors. They are his angels that he works through, and we need to pray to Hashem and pray for the speedy healing of those who are affected, to pray for those who are not, to be protected from it. We must never lose sight of the power of prayer. Our shuls may be closed, but the gates of heaven of prayer are not. We can turn to Hashem and we must turn our homes into our shuls. For the next few weeks, while our shuls are closed, we need to make sure that our homes are holy places that we can pray in, and that we daven, and that we turn to Hashem, and that we make our Shabbos a real Shabbos, and that we have a real sense of holiness and specialness in our homes. That is the calling of this time. And we need to give our full efforts and our heart and soul to that, and to our spiritual response, so that we can come out of this as a community stronger, more unified than ever, more resilient than ever, connected to Hashem. This is a time for faith. It's a time for introspection. It's a time for connection to Hashem. It's a time for our davening, for our learning, for Shabbos, for so much that is so precious to each and every single one of us. And what is so important is the mitzvah for our times is to protect ourselves and to protect our loved ones, to protect our fellow countrymen, so that we can go forward and get to the other side of this. And it will pass. The time will come where it will pass, and we need to be strong, and we'll get through it. We'll get through it with the blessings of Hashem, and we will get through it with our unity as a community. So this recording will be made available to the community. I know there were a lot of people who couldn't get into the Zoom room because it was completely overflowing, and this recording will be made available to our community. We'll gather again next week on Sunday, please God, at 4 o'clock, and for updates. And if we stay together and stick together and understand and remain connected to Hashem and dig deep, we will come through this and get to the other side stronger and more unified and more inspired than ever before. So please God, go forward with refuah, with strength, and may Hashem bless us all. God bless you, and thank you for joining us today.